Words without context have no meaning. Whether words are spoken or written, if a context isn't supplied, then we can't be certain of their meaning. Context rules, and in the case of a written text like the Bible, the context for all the words belongs to the inspired authors. Perhaps worse than not knowing the context for a particular book in the Bible is failing to consider the author's context and then imposing a different one back upon the text. To be sure, reading meaning into the Bible leads to improper interpretation. Thus, the author's message, their reason for writing the text in the first place, is completely lost. This brings me to the letter written to the Romans in the New Testament. In the next few weeks, I plan on uploading videos in which we will examine Romans together. But first, in this episode and the next, I want to talk about the context and background of Romans. After all, words without context have no meaning. And so we will frame our contextual investigation of Romans by asking who, what, where, when, and why. First up, who, as in who wrote the letter to the Romans? Well, the very first word in the very first sentence of Romans tells us that the author was the Apostle Paul. Moreover, it's unanimous amongst the patristic fathers and biblical scholars today, who rarely agree on anything, that the author of Romans was, in fact, this Paul, formerly known as Saul, who at first persecuted the church and after encountering the risen Lord became a follower of Jesus himself. Naturally, we want to know more about Paul, so we ask, who was Paul? According to Acts chapter 22, verse 3, Paul was a Jew. To be more specific, Paul was a first century Second Temple Jew. Moreover, Paul was born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but Paul was brought up in Jerusalem and educated as a Pharisee. Therefore, being trained as a Pharisee, Paul would have been very zealous for maintaining the strictest adherence to the Torah. And so it goes without saying that Paul knew his Old Testament inside and out, and would have also been well acquainted with other non-canonical Jewish writings, such as the Wisdom of Solomon. At this juncture, it's important to point out that by the time Jesus and Paul showed up in the Holy Land, Greek culture had deeply influenced Jewish society. This is evident by the fact that the most popular Bible in Jesus' day was a Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. Moreover, when the Old Testament is quoted in the New, it often reflects the Septuagint's translation. Now, all this to say, many well-educated Jewish men, like Paul, would have not only been taught the Hebrew Scriptures, but they would have also been trained in Greek philosophy, the Greek language, and especially the Greek discipline of persuasion known as rhetoric. Not to be confused with our modern gloss for identifying bombastic political speech, but rhetoric, as in the ancient art of persuasion. Of course, the world in which the Apostle Paul lived was much different from our own. All the cultures of the Bible were oral cultures. This means that the spoken word, not the written word, was the dominant form of communication in Paul's day. Great orators like Cicero were idolized and celebrated in antiquity, much like pop stars are today. In addition, although the majority of people living in Paul's day couldn't read or write, their capacity for memorization was incredible. Thus, the art of speaking eloquently and effectively in public and the ability to memorize was giving pride and place in the ancient world. So much so that the famous Greek philosopher Socrates insisted that writing destroyed the memory and weakened the mind. In this light, The oral nature of Paul's culture would have not only influenced the way he wrote letters, but also how those letters were read. All the New Testament documents reflect the oral culture from which they were written, and in case you didn't know, they were intended to be read out loud. Jesus' first followers produced texts that were intended to be read out loud, to be proclaimed, to persuade non-believers, and to encourage the faithful. For this reason, Romans reflects Paul's rhetorical skill, and the message in Romans is the message Paul would have preached if he could address the Romans in person. We've been talking a great deal about who the Apostle Paul was, and now I'd like to say a few words about who Paul was not. The Apostle Paul wasn't a Western person, modern or otherwise. Paul wasn't a 5th century Western Platonist philosopher, nor was he a 16th century Western theologian. When Paul discussed theology, he didn't break things down systematically, but instead he appealed to a storied universe, which was shaped by the Hebrew Scriptures, the influence of Greek culture, and of course Paul's own story. Paul didn't write to the 1st century Christians living in Rome to teach them about systematic theology. Instead, he used theology in down-to-earth concrete ways to address the Christian Romans' specific needs. By definition, an apostle is a person who has seen the risen Lord de facto. The author of Romans, Paul, was an apostle. Later Western thinkers were not. The word of the Lord came to the Apostle Paul, and it was Paul who was given authority. Thus, the context for Romans is Paul's. If we truly want to hear God's message in Romans, then we must start with Paul. Now, before we can bring the who section of our inquiry to a close, there are other who questions we should ask. Like, who did Paul write his letter to the Romans to? Certainly, this might seem like an inconsequential question. After all, the answer to the question is revealed in the question itself, to the Romans. But I seek to make a point that goes beyond the question, namely, that Paul's letter is addressed to all who are beloved of God in Rome. Notice, Romans isn't addressed to you or me or to anyone other than those particular 1st century Christians living in Rome. They are Paul's targeted audience, and he's writing to them to tackle specific issues that are relevant for their specific situation. Yes, Romans matters for us today, and its message is for us. It just wasn't written to us. Therefore, if we want to know what God's message in Romans means for us today, then we must read Romans through the eyes of Paul's first intended audience. Having said that, let's now narrow our focus and ask the final who question. Who were those 1st century Christians living in Rome? The first thing we need to know is that by the time Paul wrote his letter to the Romans, there was already a large number of Christians living in Rome. And unlike Paul's other letters of the New Testament, the Roman Christians were not his converts. Moreover, it's essential to keep in mind that the Roman Christians didn't assemble in large ornate structures, but instead met in house churches. And at the end of Paul's letter, it is evident that he is aware of at least 5 house churches there in Rome. The Roman Christians were made up of both Jews and Gentiles alike, and their principal language was Greek, the language in which Paul writes. According to many scholars, the Jewish Christians in Rome were descendants of the Jews enslaved under Pompey, and they were also the first Greek-speaking Jews to embrace faith in Messiah Jesus. Regarding the Gentile Christians, several Roman sources such as Plutarch, Juvenal, and Suetonius attest to the fact that Judaism was very attractive to many non-Jewish Romans. Therefore, it stands to reason that some of Paul's Gentile audience may have once been either proselytes or God-fearers. God-fearers were those Gentiles who attended synagogue services but did not fully convert to Judaism. I wonder why. While proselytes were God-fearers who fully converted to Judaism. In the final analysis, because Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, then it's plausible that he wrote Romans primarily with the Gentile Christians in mind. However, in his introduction, Paul greets all the Christians in Rome. Not to mention, in his thesis statement given in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, Paul addresses both Jew and Gentile alike. And so, although it would seem the evidence tips the scales towards the Gentiles as far as Paul's targeted audience goes, because the theme of Romans is dominated by Jew-Gentile relationships, then I think it's safe to say that Paul wouldn't have minded if the Jewish Christians in Rome took his letter to heart as well. Okay, I've given you a lot to think about. So let's take a break here. Next time, we'll continue investigating the background of Romans, and there we'll ask the what, where, when, and why questions. Until then, remember, words without context have no meaning. Context rules, and in the case of written texts like Romans, the context for the words in the text belongs to the author. The Apostle Paul was the inspired author of Romans. Therefore, the context belongs to him. Paul was a first-century Jewish Christian who lived in a world very much different from our own. Furthermore, in his letter to the Romans, Paul addresses the specific needs of his contemporaries living in Rome, and to do so, he applied theology in clear, beneficial, and life-practical ways. In Romans, Paul was killing two birds with one stone. Therefore, in order to understand why Romans matters to us today, we must step into Paul's sandals and read from his letter, not into it, for all it's worth. God bless you. If you'd like to take part in the discussion, please feel free to do so in the comment section down below. And please don't forget to like and share. And if you haven't done so, please consider subscribing. Thank you.